Life has a way of shattering our illusions when we least expect it. For Henry Cameron, successful attorney and family man, that moment came on a balmy evening in September, when the carefully constructed facade of his perfect life began to crumble beneath the weight of a betrayal he never saw coming. Henry Cameron stood at the large bay window of his home office, gazing out at the meticulously manicured lawn that stretched before him. At 47, he had achieved everything he'd ever dreamed of: a successful career as an attorney, a beautiful home in an upscale neighborhood, and a loving family. His reflection in the glass shook a man in his prime: salt and pepper hair neatly styled, sharp blue eyes that missed nothing, and a physique kept trim by regular visits to the gym. As he sipped his morning coffee, Henry's thoughts drifted to his wife, Lorraine. They had been married for 20 years, and for the most part, it had been a happy union. Lorraine was vivacious and charming, with a zest for life that had initially drawn Henry to her. She was always planning their next adventure, whether it was exotic vacation or a new hobby they could pursue together. Her enthusiasm for life had been a perfect counterbalance to Henry's more serious, methodical nature. But lately, something has changed. Henry couldn't quite put his finger on it, but there was a subtle shift in Lorraine's behavior. She seemed distracted, always on her phone, and their once passionate love life had cooled considerably. At first, Henry had chalked it up to the natural ebb and flow of a long-term relationship. But as the weeks turned into months, a nagging suspicion began to take root in his mind. One evening, as they sat in their living room, Henry watching the news while Lorraine tapped away on her phone, he decided to broach the subject. "Lorraine," he said, muting the TV, "is everything okay? You seem distant lately." Lorraine looked up from her phone, a flicker of something guilt. Annoyance crossing her face before she smiled. "Of course, darling, why do you ask?" Henry shrugged, trying to keep his tone casual. "I don't know. You just seem preoccupied. Is work stressing you out?" Lorraine worked as an interior designer, a career that allowed her to indulge her creative side, while also bringing in a comfortable income. She shook her head, her long-boned hair swaying with the movement. "No, work's fine. I've just been busy with a new project, that's all." Henry nodded, not entirely convinced but unwilling to push further. "Okay. I just want you to know I'm here, if you need to talk." Lorraine's smile seemed forced as she replied. "I know, honey. Everything's fine, really." But as the days passed, Henry's suspicions only grew. He found himself paying closer attention to Lorraine's behavior, noting how she always kept her phone close, how she'd step out of the room to take calls, how she was spending more late nights at client meetings than ever before. It was his legal training that finally prompted Henry to take action. As an attorney, he was used to gathering evidence, building a case, and so, with a heavy heart, he began to investigate his own wife. He started small, noting down the times she left for work and returned home. He paid attention to her explanations for late nights and weekend appointments, cross-referencing them with what he knew of her current projects. And slowly, a pattern began to emerge. One night, when Lorraine was in the shower, Henry made a decision that went against everything he believed in. He picked up her phone, quickly guessing her passcode, their anniversary date, and began to scroll through her messages. What he found made his blood run cold. There in black and white were dozens of intimate messages between Lorraine and someone named Robert. The exchanges were flirtatious, explicit, leaving no doubt as to the nature of their relationship. Henry felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. His hands shook as he quickly replaced the phone and retreated to his office. For hours, he sat in the dark, a tumbler of scotch in his hand, trying to process what he discovered. Anger, hurt, betrayal. Emotions swirled through him like a violent storm. Part of him wanted to confront Lorraine immediately, to demand answers, to scream and shout, and break things. But the rational, attorney part of his brain held him back. No, he needed to be smart about this. He needed more evidence. Over the next few weeks, Henry became a man obsessed. He hired a private investigator to follow Lorraine, installed tracking software on her phone, even placed a small recording device in her car. All the while, he maintained a facade of normalcy at home, playing the role of the devoted husband, even as his heart broke a little more each day. The evidence piled up quickly. Photos of Lorraine meeting a handsome, younger man at various hotels and restaurants. Recordings of intimate phone conversations. Credit card statements showing purchases of lingerie and expensive gifts that had never made their way home. Robert, it turned out, was a client of Lorraine's. A wealthy businessman who had hired her to redecorate his penthouse apartment. Henry's investigator dug deeper, uncovering a history of affairs and broken marriages in Robert's past. He was a serial philanderer, and Lorraine was just his latest conquest. As the annual Cameron family dinner approached, Henry found himself at the crossroads. Should he confront Lorraine with what he knew, or should he bide his time building an ironclad case for the divorce he now knew was inevitable? The decision was taken out of his hands on the night of the dinner. Henry was in the kitchen, putting the finishing touches on the roast when he heard the front door open. Lorraine's voice drifted in, accompanied by a deep, masculine laugh that Henry didn't recognize. "Henry, darling," Lorraine called out, "I hope you don't mind, but I've brought a friend. This is Robert. He's been helping me with some design ideas for the living room." Henry froze, his hand tightening on the carving knife he'd been using. Slowly, he set it down and turned to face his wife and her lover. Robert was every bit as handsome as the photos have shown. Tall, with dark hair and a chiseled jawline, he looked like he'd stepped out of a men's fashion magazine. He smiled easily, extending a hand to Henry. "Nice to meet you, Henry. Lorraine's told me so much about you." Henry forced himself to shake Robert's hand, fighting the urge to break every finger in the man's grip. "Has she now?" he said, his voice tight. "Funny, she hasn't mentioned you at all." An awkward silence fell over the kitchen. Lorraine laughed nervously, moving to the refrigerator. "Anyone want a drink?" "Robert, I know you'd like a good cabinet." "Henry, your usual scotch." Henry nodded curtly, his mind racing. What was Lorraine thinking, bringing her lover to their family dinner? Was this her way of coming clean? Or was she so confident in her deception that she thought she could introduce Robert right under Henry's nose? As the evening progressed, Henry found it increasingly difficult to maintain his composure. He watched as Robert charmed his parents, his sister and her husband, even his teenage niece who giggled at every joke the man made. All the while, Lorraine flitted about, the perfect hostess, but Henry could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes darted nervously between him and Robert. It was during the main course that Henry finally snapped. Robert was in the middle of regulating the table with a story about a recent business trip to Paris when Henry stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. "That's enough," he said, his voice low but filled with barely contained rage. "I can't do this anymore." The table fell silent, all eyes turning to Henry. Lorraine looked pale, her fork frozen halfway to her mouth. "Henry," she said uncertainty, "what's wrong?" Henry laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "What's wrong? You want to know what's wrong, Lorraine? How about the fact that you've been fucking this man for months behind my back?" Gasps echoed around the table. Henry's mother let out a small cry of shock, but Henry was beyond caring. He rounded the table, advancing on Robert who had risen to his feet, hands held up in a placating gesture. "Now Henry," Robert started to say, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." He never got to finish his sentence. With a roar of anger, Henry grabbed the back of Robert's head and shoved it down into his bowl of soup. There was a loud splash, followed by sputtering and coughing as Robert came up for air, his face and shirt covered in creamy butternut squash soup. Chaos erupted in the dining room. Chairs toppled as people jumped to their feet. Lorraine was screaming at Henry to stop, while his father tried to pull him away from Robert, but Henry was beyond reason. Years of pent-up anger and betrayal poured out of him as he pummeled Robert, landing blow after blow on the younger man's face and body. It took the combined efforts of his father and brother-in-law to finally drag Henry off Robert. By then, Robert's face was a mess of blood and bruises, and Henry's knuckles were split and swollen. "Get out," Henry snarled, shrugging off the restraining hands. "All of you, get out of my house." Now, the guests didn't need to be told twice. They hurried out, muttering apologies and casting worried glances back at Henry. Soon, only Henry and Lorraine remained, standing at opposite ends of the ruined dining room. "How could you?" Lorraine whispered, tears streaming down her face. "How could you do this?" Henry laughed incredulously. "How could I? How could you, Lorraine? How could you betray our marriage, our family, for that? That piece of shit?" Lorraine shook her head vehemently. "You don't understand. Robert and I, it's not what you think. We're just friends. You're imagining things." "Friends," Henry spat. "Is that what you call it? Do you often sleep with your friends, Lorraine? Do you often buy lingerie for them and meet them in hotel rooms?" Lorraine's face paled. "You've been spying on me." "I didn't need to spy," Henry lied, not wanting to admit the lengths he'd gone to. "You've been careless, Lorraine. Did you really think I wouldn't notice?" Lorraine's demeanor changed then, her tears drying up as anger took their place. "So what if I did sleep with him? You haven't touched me in months, Henry. You're always working, always distracted. Robert makes me feel alive, desired. When was the last time you made me feel that way?" Her words cut deep, but Henry refused to let it show. "If you were unhappy, you should have talked to me. We could have worked on our marriage. Instead, you chose to destroy it." "Our marriage isn't destroyed," Lorraine insisted. "We can work through this, Henry. We can go to counseling, take some time away together. Please don't throw away 20 years over one mistake." Henry shook his head, a sad smile on his face. "It's not just one mistake, Lorraine. It's months of lies of betrayal. I don't think I can ever trust you again. And without trust, what do we have? So that's it." Lorraine's voice rose, hysteria creeping in. "You're just going to throw me away? After everything we've been through together?" "No, Lorraine," Henry said quietly. "You threw us away the moment you decided to cheat. I'm just making it official. I want a divorce." The word hung in the air between them, heavy and final. Lorraine's face crumpled, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "No," she whispered. "No, I won't agree to that. We can fix this, Henry. Please, just give me a chance." But Henry had made up his mind. He turned away from Lorraine, heading for his office. "It's over, Lorraine. You'll be hearing from my lawyer." As he shut the door behind him, Henry could hear Lorraine's sobs echoing through the house. But he hardened his heart against them. He had work to do. Over the next few weeks, Henry threw himself into preparing for the divorce. He gathered all the evidence he collected, organized his finances, and began to plan for a future without Lorraine. But there was one more thing he needed to do before he could move forward. Robert, the man who had destroyed his marriage, needed to pay. Not just for the affair with Lorraine, but for all the other lives he'd ruined with his selfishness. Henry knew he couldn't take physical revenge. The disastrous family dinner had shown him the folly of that approach. But he could hit Robert where it really hurt. His reputation and his business. Through his network of contacts, Henry reached out to a trusted journalist friend, Sarah Jennings. Sarah was known for her hard-hitting exposes, particularly in the world of business and finance. Henry arranged to meet her at a small cafe, far from his usual haunts. "Thanks for meeting me, Sarah," Henry said as they sat down. "I've got a story you might be interested in." Sarah raised an eyebrow, pulling out her notebook. "I'm listening." Henry took a deep breath and began to lay out everything he knew about Robert. The affairs, yes, but more importantly, the shady business dealings he'd uncovered during his investigation. Robert, it seemed, had a habit of using inside information to make stock trades, a clear violation of SEC regulations. "I can provide you with documents," Henry said, sliding a USB drive across the table. "Bank statements, emails, everything you need to prove what he's been doing." Sarah's eyes widened as she flipped through the printouts Henry had brought. "This is explosive," she said. "But Henry, why are you bringing this to me? What's at stake in this?" Henry considered lying, but decided honesty was the best policy. "Robert had an affair with my wife," he said quietly. "He'd ruined my marriage, my family. I want him to face consequences for his actions, all of his actions." Sarah nodded slowly. "I see, and you're sure about this information?" "It's all legit. I stake my professional reputation on it," Henry assured her. "Everything there can be independently verified." Sarah tucked the USB drive into her bag. "All right, I'll look into it. But Henry, you know I can't guarantee anything. And if this goes to print, there might be blowback on you and your wife." Henry nodded grimly. "I understand. But it's a risk I'm willing to take." As he left the cafe, Henry felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He'd set the wheels in motion. Now he just had to wait and let justice take its course. The article broke 3 weeks later, splashed across the front page of the city's most respected newspaper. "Prominent businessman Robert Anderson implicated in insider trading scandal," the headline screamed. The story detailed Robert's illegal activities, complete with damning evidence and quotes from anonymous sources within his company. The effect was immediate and devastating. Robert's company's stock plummeted. He was forced to step down as CEO pending an investigation. His face was plastered across every news channel. His reputation in tatters. Henry watched it all unfold with a grim satisfaction. He knew it wouldn't undo the damage to his marriage, but it felt like a form of justice. Robert had taken something precious from him. Now Henry had taken something precious from Robert. As the scandal unfolded, Henry moved forward with the divorce proceedings. He filed the paperwork, citing irreconcilable differences and Lorraine's infidelity. Lorraine, for her part, seemed shell-shocked by the rapid turn of events. She vacillated between pleading for another chance and lashing out in anger, accusing Henry of orchestrating Robert's downfall. "How could you do this?" she screamed during one heated argument. "You've ruined him." Henry remained calm in the face of her anger. "I didn't ruin him, Lorraine. He ruined himself. I just made sure the truth came out." The day of the divorce hearing arrived, a crisp autumn morning that seemed at odds with a somber mood. Henry arrived at the courthouse early, dressed in his best suit, his lawyer by his side. Lorraine arrived separately, her once immaculate appearance now slightly disheveled, dark circles under her eyes speaking to sleepless nights. As they sat on opposite sides of the courtroom, Henry couldn't help but think back to their wedding day 20 years earlier. Lorraine had been radiant in her white gown, a smile bright enough to light up the entire church. "He'd thought that they'd be together forever, haven't you?" The judge entered and the proceedings began. Henry's lawyer presented their case methodically, laying out the evidence of Lorraine's infidelity and the irreparable breakdown of the marriage. Lorraine's lawyer tried to argue for a more equitable distribution of assets, claiming that Henry's actions had contributed to the marriage's failure. But in the end, the judge sided largely with Henry. The prenuptial agreement they'd signed was upheld, leaving Lorraine with a settlement that, while substantial, was far less than she would have received without it. Henry was awarded the house and primary custody of their children, with Lorraine granted visitation rights. As the judge read out the final decree, Henry watched Lorraine's face crumple. She buried her head in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. For a moment, he felt a pang of sympathy. Despite everything, he had loved this woman for 2 decades. But he quickly squashed the feeling. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with the consequences. This is outrageous. Lorraine suddenly exclaimed, jumping to her feet. Her voice echoed through the courtroom, drawing all eyes to her. You can't do this to me, Henry, tell them. Tell them it's all a misunderstanding. The judge banged his gavel. Mrs. Cameron, please control yourself, or I'll have you removed from the courtroom. But Lorraine was beyond reason. She turned to Henry, her eyes wild with a mixture of anger and desperation. How can you sit there so calmly? How can you destroy our life together like this? I made a mistake, Henry. One mistake. Doesn't our marriage mean anything to you? Henry stood slowly, buttoning his suit jacket. He looked at Lorraine, really looked at her, for what he knew would be the last time. The woman he had loved was still there, somewhere beneath the anger and the fear. But she was a stranger to him now. Our marriage meant everything to me, Lorraine, he said quietly. That's why your betrayal hurt so much. That's why I can't forgive you. It wasn't just one mistake. It was months of lies, of sneaking around behind my back. You brought your lover into our home, Lorraine. You introduced her to our family. How am I supposed to move past that? Lorraine's anger seemed to deflate, replaced by a crushing sadness. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry, Henry. Please, can't we try to work this out? But Henry was already turning away. It's too late for that, Lorraine. I hope you find happiness, I really do. But it won't be with me. Goodbye. As he walked out of the courtroom, Henry could hear Lorraine calling after him, her voice growing more desperate with each unanswered plea. But he didn't look back. He couldn't. It was time to move forward, to start the next chapter of his life. The months following the divorce were challenging. Henry threw himself into his work, taking on more cases than ever before. He spent his evenings and weekends with his children, trying to provide stability and normalcy in the wake of their family's upheaval. Emma, their 15-year-old daughter, was angry and withdrawn, lashing out at both Henry and Lorraine. Jack, their 12-year-old son, became quiet and introspective, his grades slipping as he struggled to process the changes in his life. Henry did his best to be there for them, to answer their questions honestly without demonizing their mother. It was a delicate balance, and there were days when he felt like he was failing miserably. But slowly, gradually, they began to adjust to their new normal. Lorraine, meanwhile, seemed to be spiraling. Henry heard through mutual friends that she had moved in with her sister, unable to afford a place of her own with the reduced settlement. She had lost her job at the interior design firm, a reputation tarnished by association with Robert Stendhal. There were rumors of drinking, of erratic behavior. Part of Henry wanted to reach out, to offer help or at least a sympathetic ear. But he knew that would only complicate things for him and for the children. He had to maintain boundaries for all their sakes. As the one-year anniversary of their divorce approached, Henry found himself reflecting on the journey he'd been through. The pain of Lorraine's betrayal had dulled to a low ache, no longer the sharp, constant agony it had been in those first few months. He still had moments of anger, of regret, of wondering what might have been if things had been different. But overall, he felt, okay, not happy exactly, but at peace with the decisions he'd made. One evening, as he sat on the back porch watching the sunset, Emma came out to join him. She'd been more open lately, less angry, and Henry treasured these moments of connection with his daughter. "Dad," she said, her voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "Can I ask you something?" Henry nodded, turning to give her his full attention. "Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind?" Emma fiddled with the hem of her shirt, not meeting his eyes. Do you ever think about forgiving Mom? Like, or maybe, letting her come back home?" The question caught Henry off guard. He took a moment to gather his thoughts before responding. "Emma, your mom will always be a part of our family. She's your mother, and nothing will ever change that. But what happened between us? It's not something that can be easily fixed or forgotten. But people make mistakes, right? Emma pressed. You always taught us that it's important to forgive. Henry sighed, running a hand through his hair. You're right, forgiveness is important. And I have forgiven your mom, in a way. I'm not angry with her anymore. But forgiveness doesn't always mean going back to the way things were. Sometimes it just means accepting what happened and moving forward. Emma nodded slowly, processing his words. I guess I just miss how things used to be, she said quietly, before everything got so messed up. Henry put an arm around her shoulders, pulling her clothes. I know, sweetheart. I miss it too. But we can't go back. All we can do is make the best of where we are now and look forward to the future. As they sat there, watching the last rays of sunlight fade from the sky, Henry felt a glimmer of hope. It had been a long, difficult year, full of pain and challenges. But they survived. They were healing. And maybe, just maybe, they were on the path to something better. The next morning, Henry woke early, as was his habit. He went through his usual routine. A quick workout, a shower, breakfast with the kids before sending them off to school. But as he sat down at his desk to start his workday, he found his mind wandering. He thought about Lorraine, about the life they had shared and the way it had ended. He thought about Robert, whose life had been destroyed by his own actions, and Henry's quest for justice. He thought about his children, resilient yet still bearing the scars of their family's upheaval. And for the first time in a long while, Henry allowed himself to think about the future. Not just in terms of work or raising his kids, but his own personal future. Was there a possibility of love again? Of trust? Or had Lorraine's betrayal closed that door forever? He didn't have answers to these questions yet. But as he turned his attention to the case files on his desk, Henry felt a sense of cautious optimism. Life had thrown him a curveball, shattered the future he thought was certain. But he survived. He had come through the storm stronger, wiser, more sure of himself than ever before. Whatever the future held, Henry knew he was ready to face it. Not as a victim of betrayal, not as a man defiant by his past, but as someone who had been tested by fire and emerged tempered, resilient, ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. As he immersed himself in his work, Henry allowed himself a small smile. The road ahead might be uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, he was looking forward to the journey.